Hello, ladies and gentlemen, Gabester here. Today we are looking at a guide for Heroic Horridon and Throne of Thunder. And this perky little dinosaur is quite challenging, actually. I think it's a well done fight. I'm not sure that I would say that it's the third most difficult heroic that we've tried, but, it's the third one we did, anyway. So, the change to heroic mode for this fight is quite a pain in the ass. And most of your raid will have to deal with this new mechanic throughout the entire fight, which really causes quite a bit of stress and chaos added on to this already pretty hectic fight. So let's just start with some basic raid comp stuff, and we'll talk about the changes on heroic. So for your raid composition, pretty standard stuff. You will want 2 tanks for sure, and 2 or 3 healers. I would highly recommend 2 healers for this fight. The actual healing per second requirement is not all that excessive compared to some fights. And outside of dispels, which are needed very frequently throughout the entire thing, you really won't find yourself limited too much by global cooldowns except at the very end, which we'll talk about when we get there. But for the majority of the fight, the actual healing output from 2 healers should be plenty. And also, the DPS check is not trivial. You don't need a severely high DPS to meet the Berserk timer, but as you'll see when we get to the end of the fight, even if you kill the Dinomancers as fast as they're available, you still have a limited period with which to finish the boss at the end of the fight. And if he's not low enough, then it's going to take you a while in that last transitional phase to actually push him down in time. So, yeah, arguably you could do 2 primary healers and 1 like Disc Priest or Mistweaver DPS healer, since the boss gains a lot of damage taken, so that's a strong way to do extra damage. But of course that means you're not doing extra damage to the adds, and where primary DPS would be doing damage to the adds, which is most important through most of the fight. So again, if you can handle it, I recommend 2 healers. It's much better. I also want to briefly mention that if you have a heavy melee DPS raid, this fight is going to feel a lot more difficult, and actually be a lot more difficult than it might otherwise. There just so happens to be a number of mechanics from the adds that you can kind of ignore, or don't really matter on normal, that happen to be around melee range primarily. And on heroic, they destroy quite severely. So it's really vital that your melee DPS players, along with your primary add tank, of course, really watch for those abilities and prioritize their survival over their DPS. So just a fair warning that, in our raid we have a pretty even split, 3 melee DPS, 3 range DPS, but I think it'd be preferable to have 1 or 2 melee DPS rather than so many of them for this particular fight. So just plan ahead for that, basically, if you have a strong melee component in your raid. So the big change on heroic is the addition of what our raid called pink elephants, although of course they're actually pink dinosaurs. So here you can see a dire horned spirit that I'm attacking there. And these spawn 1 at a time every 60 seconds throughout the entire fight. They will appear every time Dire Call is cast by Horridon. So when Dire Call completes casting, it will do pretty massive AE damage to the entire raid, physical damage. So everyone should be full health, or using some form of minor personal cooldown when that hits. And once Dire Call finishes, a new Dire Horn Spirit will spawn. These spawn basically right underneath Horridon's position. Basically within melee range is where a spirit will appear. And when they appear, the Dire Horn Spirit will immediately fixate on a random raid member and will remain fixated on that player throughout the fight unless they die. Now these spirits don't fixate randomly among all valid raid members. Instead, they actually prefer players based on their class and specifically their role. So what this means is that the first series of Dire Calls, and therefore the spirits that spawn, will fixate on ranged DPS players first. Every single dire call and new dinosaur that spawns will fixate on the next random ranged DPS player that does not have a Direhorn Spirit already on them. So if you have 3 ranged DPS, like we do in our raid, the first 3 dire calls and dinosaurs will fixate on those 3 players in a random order. Then the 4th one, once all 3 ranged DPS are selected, the next set will go to healers first. So again, if you have, say, 2 healers, then the next 2, number 4 and number 5, will go to your healers, like they do in our raid here. After the healers are done getting fixated by dinosaurs, then it will move on to melee DPS. So that's the 3rd set of targeted players. And then finally, it will move on to your tanks, of which you'll probably have 2. So the last 2, number 9 and number 10 rather, will be on tanks. All right, so managing your pink dino, which actually sounds a little bit like a sex education film I saw as a kid, but sorry about that, ignore that part. So a few tips for handling this pink dinosaur, basically. Once one fixates on you, you are the only player that can see your dinosaur, and vice versa for other players. So you will never be able to see their dinosaur, and they can't see yours. This means that you are solely responsible for managing your pink dinosaur. Now the way you do this is if it reaches melee range with you, it will basically instantly kill you. There have been situations where we've had players take a melee hit from it and not die. And our best theory is that it does 100% of your health, but if you have an absorb, you may survive. But it's far from reliable, so the point is never let it melee you and you'll be okay. Now the way you do this is by knocking it backwards. Every time you cast any ability of any kind on the Direhorn Spirit, it will be knocked back about 5 to 10 yards or so. You can see it very frequently when I knock it back on my screen. And when this gets knocked back, while it's flying through the air, it cannot be knocked again. You have to wait for it to land on the ground before it will trigger another knockback if you cast another ability on it. In addition, you cannot just keep hitting it with a dot, for example. The only thing that actually counts as an ability is the initial cast of that attack. So when you initially cast something on it and it hits and it knocks it back, if you keep channeling an ability, it does not continue to knock it back. You have to recast a new ability. So it's basically the initial hit of that cast, whatever it might be. So for example, as a mistweaver monk, one of my best abilities for this is actually my taunt ability, provoke. So obviously taunt does not do any damage, at least for my class, but it's an instant ability, it's off the global cooldown, and therefore it knocks the guy back. So I can cast this pretty much anytime I want, as long as it's off cooldown, and if he's in that 40-yard range, he'll be knocked away. So any spells that you may have like this, and I obviously can't go through the list of classes or even guess what would be best for everyone, but you'll just have to think about it for yourself. Whatever you have that's very fast cast, preferably an instant, preferably 40 yards or higher if you have anything like that, that you can cast very frequently, and that does not cost a lot of mana if mana is an issue for you. So again, using myself as an example, my 8-second taunt cooldown is not quite fast enough to knock the dinosaur back the amount of distance that he will cover. So I have to use Crackling Jade Lightning as my other ability. And this is, again, just an instant spell. I only have to let it tick for 1 tick because it's just the initial hit that matters. It doesn't actually have to do any damage or anything. So I just start casting it and immediately stop and do something else. And I weave this and my taunt back and forth. And that's pretty much how it goes for me as a Mistweaver monk. But classes that have pets, for example, you can stick your pet on them, and every initial hit from the pet will trigger a knockback when it's off cooldown. So every once in a while I'm able to stick my tiger pet on the Direhorn Spirit, and the pet will just chase him and push him way far away. And in fact, it pushes him so far that he'll get out of range. My pet will stop attacking him, despawn, and I'll even lose my focus target since I set the dinosaur as my focus. So just keep that in mind. If you have a pet, it'll be very handy to take care of the spirit for you. You just have to remember to change the pet's target if you can, or refocus it if it gets out of range, that kind of thing. The final tip for handling these is basically just to remember that it knocks it back in the direction that would be backwards from your current location. So there are some situations where you want to force it to be in a different direction than where you're facing at the time. This is especially important if your raid uses a strange position for the final phase of the fight. So you may want to loop all the way around your Direhorn spirit and push it the other direction if that's the case. You also have to be careful when you're moving toward Horridon during a charge, for example, that you don't run into your spirit at the same time. So other than that, just keep casting once every so often and pushing it back whenever you get an opportunity, and you should be okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit about tanking assignments. I mentioned this in the normal version of this guide. If you saw that, you can skip ahead a bit. But the basic idea here is that you want to hopefully control Horridon the ads as much as possible, and therefore the best way to do this is to never swap the tank on Horridon if this is an option for your raid. What this pretty much means is having a paladin in your raid. I don't think a single paladin can handle all of the clears for the entire fight, so you probably need 2 paladins if you want to do this, but I'm not 100% positive on that. But the basic idea is to clear the stacks of the triple puncture debuff on your Horridon tank after every door. This is a very common strategy for normal difficulty. And of course, this allows one tank to focus solely on Horridon, really master that role, essentially, and your other tank to do the same thing, to stick solely on the ads and get really good at mastering that role as well. So that's what we do here. If you do that, you also want to have your sort of most mitigation-based tank on Horridon and your highest DPS tank with the most utility or CC on the ads. So we have our Paladin tank on Horridon and our Monk tank on the ads throughout most of the fight. So just a small tip, if you can find a way to do that by clearing the triple puncture stacks, then that may be beneficial to you throughout the fight, especially while you're learning. So one very important thing to consider is the positioning of your raid, as well as Horridon, and how they relate to the door that your raid is currently dealing with, whichever troll door is active. So this is especially important if you have a heavy melee DPS raid, which I talked about a little in the composition section of the guide. So like our raid here, we have 3 melee DPS, which is pretty heavy on the melee. And this means that the positioning for those players especially, but the raid as a whole, is really important, because if you don't do it properly, you're going to have a lot of ground effects that are going to cover random portions of the room, and you need to make good use of the space that you're given to not only control those effects, keep them away from players, but also control Horridon's position when he charges the random raid members. So as I describe what we're doing, I would just suggest focusing mostly on the video footage of where Horridon is, how he's faced, how the raid moves, so like how the casters move, and how the melee move, and sort of how they all relate throughout the, as the door phase transitions. So the basic thing we found that works best for the melee heavy composition is to position Horridon straight in front of the door, out about 30 yards from the door, so 30 or 40 yards. So you can see that he's just brought right in front of the door, in front of that little bump, and then turned sideways. So the side of Horridon is facing the doorway. This means that the only person that has to move for the normal double attacks is just the primary Horridon tank. And then the only time we have to react is when a charge occurs. And if the player that's getting charged is reacting fast enough, they can move near Horridon toward the front of him, and by the time the charge finishes and he actually swipes at the charged player, he'll already be facing that side position, just like you see here again. So 90% of the time, if players react fast enough to charge, the rest of the raid should not really have to move for any reason for double swipe. So once the Horridon's in position, then you can focus on the raid positions. So as we start the phase over again, just to focus on one so you can see it repeated, the basic idea is that we have our range DPS slightly behind our melee DPS, heading toward the next door. So going in a clockwise fashion around the outside of the room. So you can kind of see our Shadow Priest mage off to the left of me there, Boomkin bottom there. So our range is sort of clockwise toward the next door, and our melee are right now on the boss, but then they will move in to attack adds in a moment, sort of to the right, so the bottom right of the screen. And then as the adds build up, they will sort of move as necessary when things on the ground sort of force the raid to keep moving toward the next door. So we'll all back up with the ranged further away than the melee, and this process continues. This also means that our Horridon tank can move with the raid. So when things start to get too chaotic here, there's a lot of stuff on the ground, he can back up and just continue to keep that same relative position to the raid. So the side of the dinosaur, the left side of Horridon, remains facing the raid at all times throughout the phase. And this worked really well for us once we practiced it a bit and got used to it. The main thing to focus on is not to be afraid to utilize the space given to you within the room. So you're going to feel constricted at first and feel like you don't have enough space, but you do have quite a bit. The key is to really focus on picking up the adds that are, tauntable or attack or have aggro, basically, that your tank can get, and then controlling those in a good space and moving as soon as necessary based on ground effects. There should always be a free space available if you move frequently enough. So there you can see we sort of spread out the sand traps on the ground, and now we're clear of the wave, and then we can move on to the next door. All right, so with the basic mechanics out of the way, I think the best thing to do is just to cover each of the doors in turn and talk a little bit about the intricacies of those specific sections. So for the first door, Farraki, I already talked about the positioning. You can see that sort of getting set up here. And of course we're attacking Horridon early on in the fight just to do extra DPS until the adds have to be dealt with. Now pretty much all the adds here for this door can and should be tanked by your add tank. So you'll pick up the first double set, and then the first balcony add in the center will drop. There he is there. And once he gets down, your DPS should ideally focus him down quickly. If you burn him fast enough, he may not get a trap cast on the ground. But if he does, it will only be one, so it's not a big deal. The other thing that's really important here is dispels. So, of course, these cast an AE, and it actually hits the 3 closest players to the Wastewalker when it lands. So this will apply the Blazing Sunlight debuff on all of them, which is, of course, a stacking dot. And it does 120,000 damage initially, and then it also does damage over time. And this damage over time effect actually stacks. So you want to dispel this frequently without wasting too many dispels. And this took a bit of practice for the Paladin Healer and myself to sort of get down. But the basic idea that we came up with, and sort of unspoken rule, but it seemed to work, is that the initial casts from the first Wastewalker, we pretty much dispel off the non-tank DPS that it gets applied to. And then when the 2 Wastewalkers come down at the same time, so the second and the third mobs, when they drop and they cast, this will prevent, hopefully, the DPS from reaching a third stack. Because if they get 3 at once, that's a huge amount of damage. The initial damage, of course, 360,000, plus dot damage of a 3 stack is quite high. So we wanted to prevent a 3 stack pretty much. Anytime it was 2 or above, we would dispel instantly, and prioritizing the non-tank DPS that got those stacks. And also, of course, if it's multiple non-tank DPS, then you prioritize those that are lowest health that are therefore in most danger. Other than that, DPS can really AE, and they don't have to choose too much what they target. You don't want to leave the stone gazers completely, unafflicted, because they'll just stun somebody. You have to dispel that if they want to get out of it. So just try to AE things down. It doesn't so much matter if you single target beyond that first Waste Walker. And otherwise, this door is not too difficult. The main thing, of course, is sand traps are very, very deadly. So the best thing you can do is to have people just be aware of their surroundings and communicate. So I can't tell you the number of times that our paladin healer, said, "Hey Cole, there's a sand trap near us," because we tend to be meleeing the boss at this time while we can. So yeah, just communicate with people and say, there's a trap near you, watch out. And if everyone does this, you shouldn't really fall victim to it. The other thing you can do, it's more difficult, is to watch the cast target of the Waste Walkers when they actually use the ability, because they will target the player that they're casting underneath for that sand trap. Of course, they're not boss mobs, so it's really difficult to actually see who they're targeting when there's 2 or 3 of them active, but that's the basic idea. And once everything's cleaned up, you, of course, rotate to the next section. So the second door is the Gurubashi, and this is probably the door that you'll have the most trouble with early on as you're practicing and getting used to it. The Venom Priests, of course, have an AE volley attack that hits everyone in the raid for poison and applies a poison dot. They also will spawn venomous effusions, which create a puddle when they spawn that slowly roams around in a small area that does a huge amount of damage, as well as the effusion itself that has low health, but will also use the same volley attack, applying more stacks of the dot. So these are the primary trio mobs, of course, and managing these is very important. So the biggest thing you can do to help yourself is have strong interrupts. When these guys cast Venom Bolt Volley, that's the priests themselves, you should try to interrupt it every time. The best way to do this is to just assign one interrupter to every Venom Priest based on the order that they spawn or their location. So we would have our DPS Warrior get the first one, and then I think our Shaman got the second one that was clockwise to the next door, and our Rogue got the third one that was furthest from the next door. And he would also use tricks to help get threat on the tank for that one that spawned far away. So those 3 players were primarily focusing on interrupting their particular Venom Priest. And by doing so, you can prevent most, if not all, of the volleys. You'll still likely get a volley here and there from an effusion, but effusions have such low health that often they'll die before they get a cast off. And if they do get a cast off, it's not going to be a significant amount of stacks or damage. So that's the primary thing to do to help yourself on that wave, is really have something strong that you can repeat to help you control the interrupts for the Venom Priest's casts of the volley. Now the other basic mob, of course, is the Bloodlords. These are not really all that dangerous in their own right. They are tankable, so they should be picked up by your ad tank as usual. However, they tend to charge after random players very frequently, and these are players that are at range from them. When they charge, they will cast Rend on that player, which applies a 15-second dot, and it does pretty heavy damage over time to that player. So this is mostly a concern for your healers. The best thing you can do is to make sure your healers have some sort of indication of which players have the dots on them, because those players need quite a bit of extra healing. So pretty basic. You can see in my grid sort of there's icons that show sort of that rend type effect. So it's top left, it's on the priest right now, it's on our paladin, the bottom center, that kind of stuff. So just keep track of that and make sure people are aware when they get the debuff, if something bad is going to happen to them besides that debuff, they should use a cooldown. So the most common thing for this is Dire Call. When Dire Call is occurring during this second door, make sure you announce to your raid, that players with the rend debuff should also use a personal cooldown, because otherwise they may get direct call damage and a tick of the rend, and if they're not full health especially, they're probably going to die. So keep that in mind. The paladin ability that reduces dot damage is really good for that ability, that kind of stuff. But throughout the phase, you're going to get a lot of rends just randomly strewn about. But it's not a big deal as long as you have decent healing and you're just aware of who has the debuff. The focus should still be on the trio mobs and burning them down fast, because once they're under control, you can clean up the Bloodlords without much effort. They'll only do minor damage on the actual tank, and then they'll have their bleed damage on random players. And if you focus the Venom Priest down, you don't have to worry so much about dispels and all that stuff. One thing you can also do, if you have a Mistweaver as one of your healers, as of course I am here, is to utilize your Revival to mass dispel everyone of those sort of effects. So you can do that on this Poison Wave if you have a lot of poison stacks at the end, or you can save it for the Disease Wave for the same sort of purpose. So don't use it unless you need it, because it's better to have it available as an emergency heal, but it is something that's possible there. So if you're going to use it, you'll probably want to wait until all the Venom Priests and the Effusions are dead at the end of the wave before you do it. Otherwise, it's possible to get another cast off anyway, and then you'll just have to manually dispel after that, so it'd be wasted, pretty much. So just keep that kind of thing in mind. All right, next door. What's behind door number 3? It's Drakkari. So this door, around the time this starts, you may be looking at your healer pink dinosaurs starting to spawn. Again, it depends on how many range DPS you have, since it will go through those first. But if you have 3 range DPS, then the dire call that starts during this third door is going to be on one of your healers. So it's really important your healers are aware of that and aware of their positioning. And this goes for everybody, but range DPS are generally not going to be very close to the boss, so less important for them. But if you're standing right in melee range of the boss when a dinosaur spawns on you, it may just one-shot you instantly before you can even react. So just be very careful of that. Anyway, for this actual Drakkari door, in my opinion, this is the most difficult by far. And the reason for this is primarily because of the chaos created by the fact that most of the mobs cannot be tanked and therefore very controlled. So you have, of course, the frozen warlords, which are the trio mobs, and these should be picked up and tanked by your ad tank. They do significant damage because they hit pretty hard, but in addition, they also use Mortal Strike frequently, which of course lowers healing, in this case by 50%, as well as does a lot of damage in its own right. So this will probably be the wave that your ad tank needs to focus most of their cooldowns on. The rest of the waves, obviously, you don't want to just sit there with cooldowns available a lot of the time, but most of them won't be as dangerous as this third wave for your ad tank. So this is a good time to use those big cooldowns, because they should come up again, even the 3-minute ones, by the time you're getting into the final phase against the boss. So the positioning is much the same as before. So you can see we're just kind of spreading out our range to the left, sort of toward the next door, melee in the center, boss straight out. And here you can see I've got Direhorn Spirit, so I'm sort of focusing on him. You can't see behind me very well. I apologize for that. But the problem is that the warriors and the champions are not tankable. They don't really have threat. So they'll just fixate on random players and tend to attack them. And they do pretty sizable melee damage, just white hits. But in addition to that, they also apply diseases to anyone within a short AE when they connect in melee. And this disease lasts 5 minutes, does a decent amount of damage over time, and stacks up very quickly. So this is another reason that melee can be a little bit of an issue, because they can get stacks very quickly since they're going to be clumped up most of the time. So your range DPS should try to spread out a little bit during this phase to sort of prevent those disease stacks from applying to multiple people if possible. The other thing is, like all the other phases, dispels are very important. In this case, because diseases are applied so frequently, you cannot really afford to dispel immediately as soon as you see debuffs, kind of like you might be able to do on the first wave for the fire dot. But instead, you just have to prioritize and sort of set a threshold based on how low someone's health is and or how many stacks they've got up to for the disease. So again, I just sort of focused on players that had a sizable chunk of stacks, 4 or 5 plus, or players that had some stacks, were clearly getting attacked and were not full health. So in either case, they were sort of priority over someone else that only has a couple stacks maybe. Now, another thing you can do to help yourself against the champions and warriors is, since you can't tank them, they're going to be running around randomly, attacking DPS and healers and whatnot, is to utilize stuns. Now, stun is generally not going to be a long enough duration to allow that mob to die before the stun wears out, but it will, of course, prevent damage and stop them in their tracks for a while. So you can sort of spread out a bit if you need to, or stop damage on a particular target, especially if it's you that's getting attacked. You want to buy yourself some time for survival, that kind of thing. So really just take advantage of all the stuns you have available. And other than that, your goal should be to AE everything. You can't really afford to single target here. And while they are very damaging to the tank, the Frozen Warlords are not very dangerous in terms of trio mobs that you've seen before. So they are not really prioritized in the sense that the other trio mobs might be in other waves. Instead, you want to focus on taking care of the lesser mobs and the trio mobs at the same time, just maximizing your AE DPS to do as much damage as possible. The thing to keep in mind for all these waves is that the Dinomancer that dictates, of course, when the door can be smashed and when that phase ends, is purely based on time. So your DPS for the actual phase time is only going to affect how quickly you kill the adds that are actually active on you. It will not dictate how long the phase lasts, assuming you attack the Dinomancer and click the orb right away, which you obviously will do. So in this case, I recommend just focusing on AE damage that prioritizes, maximizing DPS to as many targets as you can at once. And otherwise spread out if you're ranged. Try not to get diseased as much as possible. And, you'll have a little bit better time with it. This is also probably the best time to use Revival if you can afford not to use it on the Poison Wave. Again, if you're a Mistweaver monk. So I use it at the end of this phase when people need heals, and we have a sizable number of diseases active as well. It's a good way to clear that stuff. So, yeah. It's a pretty tough wave. For a while, we were actually bloodlusting on this wave, but we later found it was better to use it on the final phase. If you can possibly do that, I would recommend it. And otherwise, you just have to dodge the frozen orbs. Just like any of the other ground effects, technically they aren't on the ground, but they kind of hover in one area. So when one of them spawns, your melee especially need to be very aware of positioning and just move out of it immediately. And again, don't be afraid to utilize the area that you have around you. You'll tend to have Frozen Warlords active even as the door is being smashed. So after the phase technically is over, you'll have Frozen Warlords up at the same time, which you'll see here in a moment. So it's important that your tank, not be afraid to move around the room and utilize the space you have available to drop those orbs that are still going to be coming down. Just don't get orbs in front of the next doorway somewhere that you might be fighting. But otherwise you can freely move them wherever you need to, just to keep that, space safe and clear. All right. Finally, the fourth door. So for the fourth door, we have Amani. And this wave is also very difficult. I still personally think the third one is more challenging. We spent more time, getting past that and perfecting it than we did this one. But this one definitely has its own challenges, to be sure. And the main thing is that this final door is very chaotic. There are a lot of enemies that will be active at any given time, a lot of different attacks that you have to watch for. And of course, by the time you reach this door, most, if not all of your raid that is not a tank will be dealing with dire call. So they'll have to be knocking the dinosaur back all the time. So all this adds up to be quite challenging. So the first thing to briefly talk about is the flame casters. These present a unique problem that you haven't seen in the other doors, in that they're really the only mobs that you've seen that are casters, that are not strictly melee attack enemies that will run into range of players. Instead, they'll just stand there, and if you don't interrupt or silence them, they're just going to keep nuking you with fireball over and over and over. And it's really problematic if you don't find a way to handle them. The protectors, nothing really worth talking about on them. They're fairly basic and tankable, so your tank can just pick those up. And then, of course, you have the trio mobs, the warbears, that when killed will turn into the beast shaman that we're riding on their backs. So for our raid, we found, especially with heavy melee DPS, that the flame casters were one of the most problematic mobs in the wave. They would basically spawn from the doorway and then just stand there and nuke everybody over and over and over. And without a reliable way to interrupt them, it was very difficult to get threat on the tank, let alone actually get them into range, which they could be attacked, especially by the melee DPS. This was really problematic when you also add in the fact that the shamans spawned from the warbears when they die would drop the totems on the ground. And of course, these totems have a very dangerous AE. Just like all the other waves, there's some ground effect that has to be avoided. So these totems act as sort of a zoning mechanic. They would zone the raid out of particular areas, and often this would create walls or barriers between the raid and the flamecasters. So the flamecasters had this sort of protective shield of totems that were very difficult to get around for us, especially for our melee. And so you can see kind of there's a caster in the top right doing just that. Well, now you can't see him, but that was the basic idea. So even with reliable silences and interrupts, especially with the chaos in this wave, it becomes very problematic to deal with those. So one trick we found that seemed to work really well was that it appears the beast shamans that are riding the warbears do not use their totem ability while they're on top of a warbear. They will still use chain lightning while they're up there, which is quite dangerous. But by preventing the shamans from dropping off the warbear for a while into the phase, you can actually prevent totems from spawning as early, and therefore buy your raid more time in which positioning doesn't matter as much. So what we ended up doing is focusing the first warbear and the first shaman down really quickly, even though we don't actually focus the first shaman very fast in this particular clip, but that was the basic strategy anyway. And then we would ignore DPSing the second and third warbear. So that would leave two shamans on the warbears. They would chain lightning us, which again is not great, but it's not the worst thing in the world. And then during that time, they wouldn't be dropping their totems. So this would allow our melee DPS and our tank to stay pretty much within range of the door the entire phase, dealing with the flamecasters. We also then focused our DPS on the flamecasters primarily once that initial warbear and shaman were dead. This means that the tank is only dealing with two warbears and a few handful of protectors that are very, not very dangerous. They're minor enemies here. So this leaves the rest of the raid to pretty much deal with flamecasters solely, and then protectors here and there. And then once the Dinomancer spawns, and we burn him down and click the orb and shatter the gate, then we have this free time available that we can finish off the warbears and the shamans. So here you can see we just killed the warbears, both the shamans pop, and now they're going to start dropping totems pretty soon. There's a totem, right in the back there. So two of them, so there you go. That's a perfect example. So by preventing those warbears from dying until this point, we were able to stop all but one totem throughout most of that phase. And this really helps you control the, general ground area and how things are spread out. So highly recommend that if you're having trouble with the positioning on this phase. Beyond that, the only other thing that's really dangerous is Hex of Confusion. And again, I don't have proof of this, but it seems to be the case that this is also not used if a shaman is still on a warbear. So this is another reason, if it works this way, that you might want to keep the shamans on the warbears for a little bit. But once Hex of Confusion is cast, it will debuff random players and cause them to basically have a 50% chance to damage themselves every time they do, any sort of ability. So it's about 100,000 damage, and this can add up very quickly. It also, interestingly enough, can crit, and it seems to be based on your character's crit rating or crit chance. So be careful of this. The best thing to do is to just have people that can dispel curse to dispel it quickly and often. That's really the only way to go about it. I, for one, was not able to dispel it at all, so, I can only see it on my grid, but I can't do anything about it. But people that have a decurse should prioritize this mechanic over everything else in this phase, because otherwise you can see people taking 3 or 4 hits of 100k plus in just a fraction of a second, especially if they have abilities that are off the global cooldown, and those 50% chance procs all work against them. So just be very careful of that, basically, and dispel these curses as soon as you can. And once you're done with this wave, clean up any beast shamans or whatever you have left, and then move the boss, Horridon, out toward the center, somewhere that you have safe ground, and preparation for the final. So the final phase, of course, you have War God Jalak, who will spawn about a minute after the final door ends. And so you have that minute to clean up any of the ads that you have left over from door number 4, as well as get Horridon in position. So I would recommend positioning Horridon somewhere that all your raid can stack up on one side of him. So you can see here we're all stacked up on the right of Horridon. And this way War God will spawn behind us, and then our other tank can easily pick it up and move it onto the raid position. This allows the raid members that have dinosaurs chasing them to, keep that separation, so they can step back a few yards, attack War God, and then keep pushing the dinosaur back in the same direction that it's been going toward the boss, basically. This also means that when someone gets charged, they can sort of turn Horridon and just run to the tank position, which is only a few yards away, rather than forcing the entire raid to move. So, for War God himself, you really want to DPS everything you've got and burn him down fast. He does a ton of damage, especially on the tank. So you want to utilize cooldowns, and survival is of the utmost importance. He also casts Bestial Wrath every 10 seconds, which does increasing damage to the entire raid. And in addition to the Bestial Wrath, you'll also get Dire Call still. So the combination of Dire Call and Bestial Wrath is enough to probably kill non-tanks if they're not healed between the two. Any individual cast of Bestial Wrath or Dire Call will not kill a full health player unless you take forever to kill War God and his damage increase stat gets really high, in which case maybe you could die from Bestial Cry. But otherwise, a single Dire Call or single Bestial Cry will not kill a full health person. And this is really important to note, because it means the only time that someone's going to be in danger, for the most part, is when you have both of those going off at the same time. So when War God is active, make sure your raid is very aware of when Dire Call is being cast, and they use personal cooldowns, or your raid uses raid cooldowns, whatever you have available, so that the combination of those two does not kill someone. So Dire Call is the 60-second cooldown, whereas Bestial Wrath is very frequent. So the best thing to do is focus on the cooldown of Dire Call. And then, of course, your healers just have to keep the raid topped off as much as possible between the two, so that no one dies from them. After War God is dead, your healers do not need to primarily focus on the raid. You can just let minor AE heals take care of most people between Dire Calls, because it's a minute apart. And that's the only damage anyone should take during this phase. once the War God is dead. So the main focus, again, should be on tank heals at that point once the War God is down. As long as everyone else is full health, Dire Call will not kill them. Now, your raid should also be prepared for Rampage, specifically your tanks and healers. So, of course, when War God dies, this will cause Horridon to Rampage just like in normal. But the difference is that in Heroic, 100% extra damage and 50% attack speed is massive. So, again, Dire Call should not kill anybody outright, even with Rampage active. But it's a lot of damage, especially for your tanks. So, things like triple puncture and regular melee hits are going to be huge hits on your tanks. So your healers really, really need to focus on topping off your tanks during this. You may notice, just our tanks just streak up and down from full health to 20 or 30% in just a matter of a second or two. So it's vital that you keep track of that. And in fact, our monk tank there died, but he did not die to the boss. He died because our rogue vanished while he had a pink elephant, and it immediately targeted the tank and killed him. So just be aware of that's possible, and that your tanks can be targets of the pink elephants if you're late enough into the fight. So I think that should cover everything. That is the heroic Horridon fight. I can't even speak. And pretty tricky fight, but just practice each of the doors individually, and once you get used to one, you'll move on to the next, and so on, and put it all together, and then the final phase is really just a matter of survival cooldowns, especially for your tanks and your healers, and just pushing whatever you got left for your DPS. So, as always, good luck, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed, please subscribe.